was just an ordinary 13-year-old kid living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows everyone else's business, and nothing ever seems to change. It wasn't a fancy place, but it wasn't a bad one either. Our street was lined with old oak trees, their branches stretching out like arms reaching for the sky, and the houses were all painted in different shades of beige, brown, and white. There was always a steady hum in the background, the distant sound of cars whizzing by on the nearby highway, a constant reminder that the outside world was still turning while we lived our small, sheltered lives. My family wasn't wealthy, but we had enough to get by. We lived in a modest 2-story house with a small front yard and a slightly overgrown backyard where I'd spend hours during the summer trying to escape the heat by hiding in the shade of the trees. I shared a room with my older sister, Emily, which meant there was always a little bit of tension between us, especially when she'd bring her friends over. She was 17, and everything about her seemed so much more complicated than my own life. She'd go off to high school every day and then spend the afternoons with her group of friends, talking about high school dramas, makeup tips, and boys, while I was left to my own devices. My mom and dad worked long hours, like most parents, so most days I was left to fend for myself after school. At first, I hated the loneliness, but it eventually became a comfort. There was something peaceful about having the house to myself for a few hours before dinner. I could play video games, watch TV, or just listen to music. It was a time to zone out and escape into my own little world. School was easy. Not easy in the way that it was effortless, but easy in the sense that it was predictable. I was an average student, and I was fine with that. I didn't have to be the best, and I wasn't the worst either. I had friends, a few close ones. Jake was my best friend. He lived just a few houses down, and we did everything together. We'd ride our bikes to the park after school, or just wander the streets with no particular destination in mind. It didn't matter where we went, just being out there with the wind in our faces and the freedom of it all made everything feel simple. We'd talk about whatever came to our minds, video games, movies, girls, the usual stuff that 13-year-olds talk about. Jake was the kind of friend who always made things seem like an adventure, even if we were just riding to the convenience store to grab candy. We'd laugh at nothing in particular, just the way two kids in that age group do when life still feels like it hasn't thrown anything too heavy their way. But my sister Emily was always a little more distant. At 17, she was already looking ahead to her future, even if she didn't know exactly what she wanted. She had her own group of friends, and they were a world apart from mine. I didn't really understand her back then. She was always wrapped up in her own drama, getting into trouble in ways I couldn't relate to. There were nights when I'd hear her arguing with our parents about curfews or boyfriends, and I'd just retreat to my room, pretending like I didn't hear. In many ways, she was the polar opposite of me. She was constantly trying to break free from the rules, while I was just happy being left alone to do my own thing. But as much as she felt distant, I never thought of Emily as someone who was ever truly in danger. We lived in a safe, middle-class neighborhood after all. It was the kind of place where you'd leave your door unlocked, trusting that nothing would happen. The world outside our little bubble seemed so far away that I couldn't imagine anything breaking into it. I couldn't even fathom that something dangerous might be lurking just outside our door, waiting for its moment to strike. And then, of course, there was the routine. After school, I'd hop on my bike and ride home, throw my bag in the house, and then I'd head out again. Jake and I would meet up and decide where to go next. Sometimes it was the park, sometimes it was the abandoned lot at the end of the street where we'd pretend to be explorers or treasure hunters. I liked it because it was always spontaneous. There was no plan, no end goal, just the freedom to roam and enjoy the afternoon before we had to go back inside. On this particular afternoon, everything felt as ordinary as it ever did. I was about to leave my house to meet Jake when I noticed a car driving slowly down the street. It was a dark-colored sedan, something nondescript, the kind of car you wouldn't remember if you saw it again. It wasn't unusual for cars to drive down our street, but there was something about the way it moved that caught my attention. It was creeping along, almost as if it was trying not to be seen. I didn't think much of it at the time. My mind was already on what Jake and I would do next. Would we go to the park, or maybe ride our bikes to the ice cream shop at the edge of town? Whatever we did, I knew it would be fun. I had no idea that this small, seemingly insignificant moment would be the last time I would experience something as simple as a normal, carefree day. That car, the one I didn't think twice about, would come back to haunt me in ways I could never have imagined. But at that moment, I couldn't have known what was coming. I had no clue that the life I knew was about to be ripped away from me, and my world would be turned upside down forever. It was just another regular afternoon, or at least that's how it felt at the time. Jake and I had met up as usual, and we were about to set off on our bikes when the car reappeared. This time, it was parked across the street, its engine running with a man standing next to it. He looked normal at first. Tall, maybe in his early 40s, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans. He had short brown hair and glasses that reflected the sunlight in a way that made his eyes seem a little too sharp. There was nothing overtly suspicious about him, but something about his presence just felt off. Jake was already distracted, talking about a new game he had bought, but I couldn't stop glancing over at the man. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just standing there with his arms crossed, waiting for something. But my gut told me something wasn't right. I shook it off at first, telling myself that I was overthinking it. It was a quiet street after all. What was the harm in a guy just standing by his car? I tried to ignore it, pushing the unease down as we rode off toward the park, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I looked behind me, I'd see the car still there, slowly following us at a distance. It was subtle, almost like the driver was trying to stay hidden, but I could tell he was tailing us. I didn't want to worry Jake, so I didn't say anything at first. I figured maybe I was just being paranoid. We turned the corner, heading down the familiar path to the park. The car continued to follow, and by now, my stomach was in knots. I wasn't sure why, but I had this overwhelming sense of dread. As we approached the park entrance, I heard the screech of tires behind us. Without warning, the car pulled up alongside us, blocking the path. The man got out quickly, moving with an urgency I hadn't noticed before. That was when I realized something was terribly wrong. Before I could react, he was on me. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm with an iron grip. I tried to pull away, but his fingers felt like steel, cold, hard, and relentless. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with confusion. What was happening? Was this some kind of joke? But there was nothing funny about the situation. The man's eyes were cold, his face devoid of any emotion as he pulled me toward the car. "Let go of me!" I screamed, trying to twist my body free. But it was no use. The man didn't even flinch, his hold only tightening. I glanced over at Jake, who was frozen in place, his face contorted in fear. His voice was barely audible as he shouted for help, but it felt like the world had gone into slow motion. I couldn't believe what was happening. I kept struggling, kicking my legs, but every movement was futile. The man's grip was unyielding. He had this calm, almost practiced way of moving, like he'd done this before, like he knew exactly what he was doing. It was terrifying. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just some random attack. It was calculated. Jake was still yelling, trying to get the man to let me go, but it was clear that the man wasn't listening to anyone. I wanted to call out to him, to tell him to run, but I couldn't find the words. My throat felt like it was closing up. Fear had paralyzed me. Then, without warning, the man shoved me into the back seat of the car. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud, and I was thrown against the cold leather of the car's interior. I struggled to catch my breath, my pulse racing, my head spinning. The car jerked forward, and I could hear Jake's voice, now distant, as he screamed my name. I wanted to scream back, to tell him to get help, but it was too late. I was already being taken, pulled further and further from everything I knew. The car sped off, its tires squealing as it tore down the road. I glanced out the window, desperate to see anything familiar, but everything was unfamiliar. The streets blurred past, unfamiliar buildings and houses slipping by like shadows. I tried to focus, but my thoughts were a jumbled mess. I couldn't make sense of it. What was happening? Why me? The man who had grabbed me sat in the back with me, his presence looming over me like a dark cloud. He didn't say a word, just stared ahead with that same cold expression. Every time I tried to speak, my words caught in my throat, too afraid to even ask the most basic questions. Where was I going? Why was I being taken? Was anyone looking for me? I looked at the other man, the driver. He was older, maybe in his late 40s, with a full beard and a stoic expression. He didn't glance at me, his eyes fixed solely on the road. His silence was suffocating. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare where there were no answers, only more questions. I started to panic. My heart hammered in my chest. My palms were sweating and I felt dizzy. I wanted to break down, to cry out, but I held it in. I couldn't afford to show weakness. I needed to stay strong, to keep my wits about me. As the car continued down the winding roads, the trees around us thickened. The sound of the tires on the asphalt began to fade, replaced by the eerie rustling of leaves. The car pulled off the road onto a narrow gravel path. I couldn't make out much, but I could see that the landscape around us had changed. The houses, the streets, the familiarity of everything I knew. It was all gone. We were headed deep into the woods now, and I had no idea where we were. The car slowed, and finally it stopped. The engine cut off with a soft sputter, leaving only the sounds of birds in the trees and the faint rustling of branches in the wind. The man beside me opened the door and, without a word, grabbed my arm again. His grip was firm, but this time I didn't resist. I knew I wouldn't be able to get away. Not here. Not now. He pulled me out of the car and into the woods. The air smelled different here, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I tried to look around, hoping for some sign of where we were, but all I could see were trees. The cabin ahead of us was hidden in the shadows of the trees, barely visible until we were right in front of it. The cabin was run down, its wooden exterior weathered by time and neglect. The small porch creaked as we stepped onto it, and the door opened with a groan. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. There was nothing welcoming about it. It looked abandoned, but it wasn't. Not anymore. The man who had brought me here knocked on the door, a slow, deliberate knock. I don't know why, but it sent a chill down my spine. It was almost like a signal. The door creaked open and a man appeared. He was older, with gray hair and a stern expression, his face carved in lines of experience I couldn't quite understand. His eyes locked onto mine, cold and calculating, and a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was a predatory smile. Without a word, the man grabbed me by the arm and shoved me inside the cabin. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed through my bones. I felt a sudden weight in my chest, like I couldn't breathe. I was trapped. No way out. And for the first time, I realized just how powerless I was. I looked around the dimly lit room, and I knew something even darker was waiting for me inside. I had no idea who these people were or what they wanted, but I could feel the coldness in the air. The fear in my gut told me that my life, as I knew it, was over. Whatever was coming next was going to be far worse than I could have ever imagined. The cabin was dark, its interior barely illuminated by the thin beams of sunlight filtering through the dusty windows. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years, and the wooden floors creaked beneath my feet as I was shoved further inside. My legs felt like jelly, and I stumbled slightly, trying to regain my balance. The man who had pulled me from the car gave me a rough shove toward the center of the room, his hand still tight on my arm. "Sit," he commanded, his voice cold and emotionless. I didn't dare resist. I collapsed into the nearest chair, my body trembling uncontrollably. My mind was reeling. Where was I? What was happening? Was this some kind of nightmare? Every part of my being screamed for me to run, but I knew I couldn't. Not here, not now. The door had already been slammed shut, and even if I somehow managed to escape the cabin, I was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest road. The man who had opened the door earlier, the one with the gray hair, stepped forward and looked at me with those cold eyes. His smile was gone now, replaced with a stern expression that made my blood run cold. "You're not going anywhere," he said simply, his words dripping with finality. "Not until we're finished with you." The gravity of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. Finished with me? What did that even mean? 1,000 questions raced through my mind, but none of them seemed to make sense. I wanted to scream, to ask them what they wanted, but I couldn't find my voice. Fear had silenced me. The man with the glasses, the one who had grabbed me earlier, stepped forward next. He didn't say anything at first, just studied me as if I were some kind of object to be examined. He looked like. He was calculating something, sizing me up, deciding what to do next. Then, without warning, he spoke, his voice smooth and calm, almost eerily so. "Welcome to the cult of the new dawn." The words barely registered at first, and I blinked in confusion. Cult? What was he talking about? I'd never heard of anything like that before. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The word cult itself sent a wave of dread through me, but I was too scared to ask for any clarification. I just sat there, frozen. The cult of the new dawn, the man repeated, his gaze unwavering. We've been watching you, and now you're part of something much bigger than yourself. You will play your part, just like all the others before you. His words were cryptic, but one thing was clear. They were talking about something far beyond what I could even begin to understand. I had no idea what they meant by playing my part, but I knew it couldn't be good. I had no intention of staying here, of being some kind of tool for whatever they were planning. But my body betrayed me. I felt like I couldn't move, like I was being held in place by invisible chains. The man with the gray hair stepped forward again. His presence seemed to fill the room, overpowering, suffocating. There was an intensity to him that made my skin crawl. "You're here for a reason," he said, his voice low and serious. "The new dawn has been preparing for years, and now you'll help us bring about the change we've been working for. Your role is already decided. All you need to do is accept it." I didn't understand what he was saying. The change? What change? And how was I supposed to help them? 1,000 questions filled my head, but they all felt irrelevant, almost insignificant compared to the heavy weight of his words. I wanted to cry, to scream, but I knew deep down it wouldn't change anything. I was trapped, completely at their mercy. There was a pause, a tense silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. My thoughts were a chaotic mess, spinning out of control. I wanted to protest, to argue, but nothing came out. Every time I opened my mouth, I found myself unable to speak, unable to do anything except sit there, paralyzed by fear. The man with the glasses walked over to a small wooden table in the corner of the room. He picked up a thick, leather-bound book and turned back toward me, holding it out as if it were some sacred object. "This," he said, "is the first step. You will study this, learn what we believe, and prepare yourself. The ceremony is soon, and once you're part of the cult, you will understand everything. You will see the truth." The weight of his words was suffocating. Ceremony? What kind of ceremony were they talking about? My mind raced with images of strange rituals and dark ceremonies, things I had only seen in movies or heard about in scary stories. But this was real. I could feel the weight of the book in the man's hand, the ominous silence in the room, and the cold fear creeping up my spine. The man with the gray hair took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. He studied me, his expression unreadable. "You will do what is required of you. All you have to do is accept the truth," he said, his voice so calm, so controlled. It was like he was speaking in a hypnotic rhythm. I wanted to scream again, but I couldn't. I wanted to fight back, to demand answers, to find some way out of this nightmare. But my body refused to cooperate. I couldn't do anything except sit there, overwhelmed and helpless. The man with the glasses placed the book down on the table and stepped back. He nodded to the man with the gray hair, as if silently communicating something between them. The gray-haired man nodded in return and then turned toward the door. "Your training begins now," he said, his voice like a final sentence. I didn't know what he meant by training, but I knew it couldn't be anything good. My heart raced, my chest tight with fear. I was in a place I couldn't escape from, surrounded by people whose intentions I couldn't understand. They had a plan, a purpose, and I was now a part of it whether I wanted to be or not. The gray-haired man turned and walked out of the cabin, and I heard the door creak shut behind him. The man with the glasses stayed behind, watching me, his expression unreadable. It was clear that he wasn't going anywhere. He was watching me, waiting for me to comply, waiting for me to accept whatever twisted role they had planned for me. I sat there in the dim light, staring at the book on the table. It felt like a weight, like it held the key to everything I needed to know, or perhaps everything I would wish I could forget. My mind was a storm of confusion and terror. What had I gotten myself into? And how was I going to get out of it? But in the back of my mind, one thing was clear. I was going to have to play along, to pretend to accept whatever they wanted from me if I had any hope of surviving. The first few days in the cabin felt like an eternity. I was on edge, constantly waiting for something terrible to happen, but at the same time, I was too frightened to do anything. The man with the glasses, who I later learned was called Victor, was the one in charge of my so-called training. He would visit me twice a day, bringing more of the strange books and symbols, sometimes sitting in silence, other times lecturing me on the cult's beliefs. He never explained why I had been chosen or what exactly they wanted from me, but he would often mention something about the awakening and the sacrifice in the most nonchalant way, like these were things I should understand. The first book he gave me was a dark red leather-bound volume, its cover unmarked, except for a strange symbol that seemed to shift when I looked at it for too long. The pages inside were filled with incomprehensible text, filled with strange rituals, symbols, and references to deities that didn't seem to belong to any religion I had ever known. There were also drawings, detailed, almost grotesque images of ceremonies and people in elaborate robes, their faces hidden in shadow. The pictures haunted me, but I couldn't stop myself from looking at them, as if something in my mind was telling me to understand, to learn. Victor would stand over me, his arms crossed as I flipped through the pages, his gaze never leaving me. It was as if he was watching for any sign that I might try to rebel or escape, though I knew that was impossible. The room was locked tight and there were no windows large enough for me to escape through. I could barely hear anything from outside, save for the occasional chirp of birds or the wind rustling through the trees. The isolation was maddening. "Do you understand?" Victor would ask, his voice like ice. I would nod, though most of the time I had no idea what he meant. It didn't matter. I was too scared to speak, too scared to ask questions. Every time I opened my mouth, I felt like I was crossing some invisible line. There was no way to escape this, no way to go back to my old life. They had taken me, and now I had no choice but to follow along, to pretend I was learning, to pretend I understood. The second book he gave me was much thinner than the first, but the content was more disturbing. It described in detail the process of awakening, the term they used to describe their ritual to connect with their so-called deity. It was something so out of my realm of understanding that I couldn't process it at first. The awakening was tied to a series of brutal rituals involving the marking of the body, often with sharp implements, in a way that supposedly aligned the soul with the deity they worshipped. The images in the book were horrifying, people writhing in what looked like agony, their bodies covered in strange symbols, their eyes rolled back in their heads as they screamed or chanted. I remember feeling my stomach churn as I looked at the pictures. My skin crawled. Was this what they wanted from me? Was I going to be made to go through this, to endure this awakening for some god I had never heard of? The thought of it made me want to vomit, but I didn't dare voice my concerns. Every time I tried to speak, Victor would just stare at me, his eyes like ice, waiting for me to understand. The nights were the worst. Every time the sun dipped below the trees and the world outside became darker, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over me. There was something about the silence that felt suffocating, as though the entire cabin was holding its breath. I could hear the distant howling of wolves sometimes, and I would lie awake, trying not to imagine the worst things that could happen. There were others in the cabin complex, though I rarely saw them. On the fourth day, I saw another woman in the hallway, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She didn't speak to me, just passed by like I wasn't even there. Her clothes were old, worn, and I could see faint bruises on her arms, as though she had been through something traumatic. The look in her eyes haunted me for days, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew exactly what was going to happen to me. The cabin was eerily quiet. Each day blurred into the next. Victor would give me more books, more tasks, more rituals to memorize. The things he said to me were like a broken record, repeating over and over again. "You must prepare," he would say. "Your place in the cult is already decided. The awakening is coming soon." I was terrified, yes, but I also felt this strange numbness settle over me. It was like my body was preparing itself for something I couldn't control. The fear was always there, gnawing at my insides, but there were moments when I felt detached from it, as if the terror was happening to someone else, not me. My mind seemed to shut down at times, overwhelmed by the strangeness of my situation. One evening, I was given a new task. Victor handed me a piece of parchment covered in strange symbols, and told me to copy them. It was a simple task, at least compared to the other things he had asked of me. But there was something unsettling about the symbols. They looked like a language, but not one I recognized. The lines seemed to twist and curl in unnatural ways, almost as if they were alive. I stared at them for what felt like hours, trying to replicate the shapes. But something about them made my head ache, like I was looking at something I wasn't meant to understand. Victor watched me with those cold eyes, his face impassive. There was no kindness in him, no sense of empathy. He was a teacher, and I was his student, but the subject matter was madness, and I was being forced to learn it. "You'll learn to understand these symbols," he said. "Each one carries power. When you finally understand their meaning, you will be ready." Ready for what? I couldn't bring myself to ask. Every time I opened my mouth, it felt like I was putting myself in more danger. If I asked the wrong question, if I spoke out of turn, who knew what would happen? I'd already seen what could happen to people who failed to comply. Days turned into weeks, and the training continued. The more I learned, the more I realized just how deep the cult's influence reached. They didn't just want me for some vague spiritual awakening. No, they needed me for something much darker, something that had been planned long before I was ever brought here. And I was beginning to see the cracks in their facade, starting to notice the way they looked at me when I wasn't paying attention, like I was some kind of prized possession. I had heard whispers late at night from the other rooms in the cabin. Sometimes I'd hear the sounds of chanting, muffled voices that spoke in the same strange language as the symbols. The air felt thick with something unholy, and I had the terrifying sense that I was being prepared for something far worse than I had imagined. The cult had its plan for me. I just didn't know what it was yet. The days had bled together in a haze of fear, confusion, and the slow, creeping realization that the people around me, Victor, the gray-haired man, and the others I had seen in passing, weren't just part of some bizarre community. No, they were all deeply entrenched in something much darker. The cult of the New Dawn wasn't just some obscure spiritual group. It was a machine built on manipulation, ritual, and terror. And now, I had reached the point where I could no longer deny the truth. I was going to be part of something much, much darker than I could have ever imagined. It happened on the 13th day. I had been given a new book, a thin one this time, with the same eerie symbol on the cover that seemed to warp and shift the longer I looked at it. This time, however, it wasn't full of cryptic symbols or dark language. No, this one was straightforward. Too straightforward. It described in chilling detail the final rite, a ceremony that would mark my full initiation into the cult. Victor had told me that I was ready. He said that it was time for me to take my place, that I had been chosen. But I didn't understand what that meant. Not really. Every time he spoke, I could hear the conviction in his voice, but there was no warmth, no human connection. He was simply following orders, and I was nothing more than a cog in the machine. I was led into the main room of the cabin that evening. It was dimly lit by candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows across the walls. The air smelled of incense, thick and cloying, like it was trying to smother me. The gray-haired man stood near the center of the room, flanked by two other members of the cult. They were all wearing the same black robes, the same strange symbol embroidered in silver on their chests. I wanted to run. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't move. I couldn't fight it. The fear had paralyzed me. Victor stood behind me, his cold hand on my shoulder, urging me forward. I stepped into the circle they had formed, a space that felt heavy with anticipation, as if something ancient and sinister was about to unfold. There was a strange energy in the room, an electricity in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The cult members began chanting in unison, their voices low and guttural, the words foreign and haunting. The gray-haired man stepped forward, his face unreadable as always. He held something in his hands, an ornate dagger, its blade shining in the candlelight. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The blade seemed to hum with power, like it was alive, like it was waiting for something. "You're ready," the gray-haired man intoned, his voice steady, almost reverent. "This is the moment you've been chosen for. The moment when you will become one with the new dawn." I wanted to scream. I wanted to claw my way out of this nightmare, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was trapped in a prison of my own fear, and there was no escape. I was frozen in place as the ritual continued. Victor stepped forward, his hand still gripping my shoulder, his voice low and dangerous in my ear. Accept your place. Accept the truth. This is your destiny. Tears streamed down my face as I looked around at the other members, their faces blank, their eyes cold and unfeeling. There was no compassion here, no sympathy, only cold, unwavering devotion to whatever dark cause they followed. I had no idea what I was about to become, but I knew in my gut that it wasn't going to be good. The gray-haired man raised the dagger, holding it high above his head as the chanting grew louder. The sound was deafening now, vibrating through the walls, through my bones. My chest constricted, my pulse racing as if my heart was trying to escape. I could hear my breath, ragged and frantic, in the otherwise still air. "You will be marked," the gray-haired man said, his voice steady despite the growing intensity of the ritual. "You will be made one with us, as the new dawn calls you." In a blur of motion, he lowered the dagger, its tip slicing into my skin. The pain was immediate, searing, sharp, unlike anything I had ever felt before. I couldn't scream. The pain was too overwhelming. It felt as though the dagger was not just cutting my flesh, but ripping apart my very soul, branding me with whatever twisted mark they saw fit. The room seemed to spin. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out from the sheer agony. But I couldn't look away. I couldn't tear my eyes from the ritual. This was my fate now. My body. My soul. Everything was being bound to something I couldn't understand. As the blade cut into my skin, the chanting grew louder, faster. The others in the circle seemed to move in a trance, swaying slightly as they recited their unholy prayers. And then, the worst part happened. The dagger was lifted from my skin, and the gray-haired man pressed something cold and wet into the wound. It was a strange liquid, a deep crimson that seemed to glow under the candlelight. It burned as it touched my open flesh, making my whole body convulse with pain. The warmth of the blood on my skin felt like fire, like my veins were being filled with molten metal. Victor whispered in my ear again, his voice low, almost affectionate in its coldness. "You're part of us now. You've been chosen. You are no longer just a girl. You are one with the new dawn." The words felt like a death sentence, but I couldn't even muster the strength to protest. The pain was too much. My body trembled, my vision darkened, and I felt myself slipping, the edges of my consciousness blurring into nothingness. Then, everything went silent. For a moment, I thought I had died. The pain, the chanting, the ritual, it all stopped, and in its place was an eerie, suffocating stillness. I was no longer in the cabin. I was in some dark void, floating, suspended between worlds. My body felt weightless, as though I was disconnected from reality, and then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "You belong to the new dawn now." The voice lingered in my head, echoing like a soft whisper in a cavern. The words wrapped around me, invasive, like a snake coiling itself around my chest. "You belong to the new dawn now." It wasn't just a statement, it felt like a command, a truth being forced into my soul, one I couldn't escape from, no matter how hard I tried. But then, as quickly as it had come, the voice faded, and I was pulled back to reality. My body was no longer in the cabin. It was as if I had been transported somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark and suffocating. My senses returned slowly. First, I could hear the distant sound of breathing, shallow and erratic, like someone struggling to stay conscious. Then, I felt the cold. The chill of the room pressed against my skin, and the pain surged through me once more. The wound on my side throbbed, its pulse in sync with my heart, as though the mark had become a part of me. I opened my eyes, the world spinning in slow motion. I was still in the circle, surrounded by the members of the cult, but everything felt distant, as though I were watching them from some faraway place, detached from my own body. Victor stood in front of me, his face as cold and unreadable as ever. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see something different there, something almost triumphant. The gray-haired man was to his side, murmuring quietly to the others, as if the ritual was over, as if the deed had been done. The others in the circle were silent now, their gazes fixed on me as though I were a prize they had all worked together to obtain. But I wasn't sure I was still me. Something had changed. I felt altered, like something inside me had been reshaped, reformed. The wound on my side still burned, and I could feel it in the depths of my body, this searing, unnatural connection to whatever they were, to whatever this cult was about. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. It was as though the words were stuck, trapped in a place I couldn't reach. I opened my mouth again, but nothing came out. My breath was shallow and quick, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate from the fear, the pressure building in my chest. What had they done to me? Victor must have noticed my panic because he stepped forward, placing a cold hand on my shoulder. The touch felt strange, unnatural, as though it were too deliberate, too calculated. "Calm down," he said, his voice steady, almost soothing, as if he were speaking to a child. "It's over. You've been chosen. You are one of us now." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him what the hell was happening, what had been done to me. But my body wouldn't cooperate. It was like the fear had stolen my voice, like I wasn't in control anymore. The gray-haired man stepped forward then, his gaze piercing as always. He looked at me with that same emotionless expression, as if I were some object he had created, some tool that had now fulfilled its purpose. "You will begin your training immediately," he said, his voice commanding. "Now that you are marked, you will start the real work. The awakening is only the beginning." I wanted to ask what he meant by real work, but my mind was too clouded, too full of terror. What did they want from me now? What did I have to do to survive? Victor turned to the others, giving a slight nod. They all stood, suddenly in perfect synchronization, as if they had rehearsed this moment countless times. The gray-haired man waved his hand in the air, and the candles around us flickered, their flames growing brighter for a brief, unsettling moment. "Follow me," he said. I didn't move at first. I couldn't. The thought of going further into whatever twisted world they had created felt like the end of me. But Victor's hand on my shoulder tightened, pushing me forward, guiding me. I stumbled slightly but kept my feet, my mind still clouded by confusion and fear. The cabin had never seemed so large, so oppressive. It felt like the walls were closing in, the space shrinking with every step I took. There were doors I hadn't noticed before, dark wooden doors that seemed to lead deeper into the bowels of the cabin. Each one was locked, but as the gray-haired man walked to the nearest one, he simply waved his hand over the wooden surface. The door clicked open on its own, and a chill ran down my spine. Inside was a dimly lit room, larger than the one I had been in before, but it felt colder, more unsettling. The walls were lined with strange objects, crude carvings, old ritualistic tools, and more books filled with incomprehensible text. But the thing that caught my attention the most was a large stone pedestal in the center of the room, surrounded by more candles. It was bare for now, but I could tell it was meant to be used for something. The gray-haired man stepped into the center of the room, and I instinctively followed, my feet moving on their own accord. The others filed in behind us, their footsteps soft but purposeful. Victor stood behind me now, his presence like a shadow, looming over me, guiding my every move. I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on me like a heavy hand on my chest. "You're ready for the first step," the gray-haired man intoned, his voice like a command. "The awakening is complete, but now we must prepare you for what's to come. You will become an instrument of the new dawn, and the first lesson is obedience. You will follow without question. You will submit to the will of the cult." A cold shiver ran through me as I realized what he meant. This was just the beginning. The real nightmare hadn't even started yet. The room grew even darker as the candles flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. I felt the eyes of the cult members on me, their gazes sharp and predatory. They were waiting for me to fall in line, to accept whatever role they had planned for me. And in that moment, a horrifying truth began to settle in my bones. There was no escaping. Not anymore. I was trapped, not just physically, but spiritually, tethered to something far more powerful and terrifying than I could ever have imagined. "Now," the gray-haired man said, his voice cold and unwavering. "Let us begin your training." The days that followed felt like a blur, but the training was unrelenting. There were no breaks, no moments of reprieve. Each day blended into the next, and I found myself becoming more and more absorbed into the rhythm of the cult. The fear still gnawed at me, but it was beginning to feel distant, as if my mind were putting up walls around it. I didn't have the luxury of emotions anymore. Survival had become the only thing that mattered. The gray-haired man, whom I learned was called Father Magnus, took on the role of my primary instructor. He would spend hours with me each day, imparting knowledge that seemed to go far beyond anything I had learned in my life. Most of it made no sense. Fragments of ancient rituals, forbidden languages, and obscure philosophies that only deepened the sense of confusion that already clouded my thoughts. But there were moments, terrifying moments, when it all started to click. When the words and symbols began to align, and I realized they were not just random scribblings, they were instructions, commands. The cult was preparing me for something unimaginable, something that went beyond the ritual I had already endured. Father Magnus would speak to me as if I were already part of their world, as if I had always been meant to be a part of this twisted existence. He would explain things with a kind of detached reverence, his words never showing any sign of doubt. "The new dawn is coming," he would say, "and you must be ready to embrace it fully. Your role is vital. You are the vessel through which the awakening will unfold. Only by becoming one with the cult can you fulfill your true purpose." I learned to keep my mouth shut. I had questions, so many questions, but I had learned the hard way that asking them only drew more attention. There was no room for doubt here. The cult did not tolerate questions, and any sign of resistance would be swiftly punished. I learned how to perform the rituals, each one more disturbing than the last. There was one ritual in particular that I was forced to memorize in excruciating detail. It was called the binding, a ceremony in which a person's soul was bound to the new dawn. The process was long and painful, involving intricate carvings of symbols into the skin, each incision carrying a deeper meaning, each line bringing the initiate closer to the cult's will. As I practiced, I was often made to mark others, each cut a reminder that there was no escape, no way out of this place. The markings were not just physical, they were psychological, branding the victim with a sense of ownership, a sense of purpose that only the cult could give. The awakening I had gone through was not the end. It was only the beginning of what Father Magnus called the transformation. It was not a simple thing, like being chosen by a god. No, it was much darker. I was being shaped, reformed into an instrument of the cult's will. My mind, my body, my very soul were being bent to serve their purpose. Some nights, I would lie awake in my room, the sounds of chanting and murmurs from other rooms drifting in through the walls. The others, people like me, brought here for the same purpose, would occasionally gather, whispering to each other about their experiences. I overheard pieces of their stories, of their pasts before the cult took them. Some of them seemed to have accepted their fates already, their eyes hollow with the kind of devotion I could never bring myself to feel. They spoke in reverent tones about the new dawn, about the sacrifices they had made for it, and about the awakening that had granted them new life. But there were others, like me, who had not fully succumbed. I could see it in their eyes, faint flickers of resistance, of fear, that had not yet been extinguished. But there was no room for weakness here. Those who showed too much fear were taken away, never to return. The cult was a machine, and each person had a role to play. Weakness was not tolerated. My own role, I was beginning to understand, was to become one of the key figures in their dark plans. Father Magnus had made it clear that the transformation was not just about physical endurance. It was about accepting a new identity, a new purpose, one that would bind me to the cult forever. The cult's ultimate goal was nothing short of domination, control over those who refused to worship their twisted deity, and I was going to be a part of it. One evening, Father Magnus led me to a room I had never seen before. It was hidden deep within the cabin, tucked away behind a set of heavy wooden doors that were locked tight until now. The room was vast, with high ceilings and walls lined with shelves full of ancient artifacts, scrolls, and more books. In the center of the room was an altar, its surface stained dark with something I didn't want to ask about. "This is where it will all begin," Father Magnus said, his voice low and reverent. The ritual that will bind your soul to the new dawn. The binding, the ultimate act of devotion, is where we will fuse your essence with the power that awaits us. When the time comes, you will be the key. I stood there in shock, the words sinking in slowly. I was going to be the key to something even darker than what I had already witnessed. The thought made my stomach churn, but there was no room for hesitation. My training had already begun. There was no turning back. Days later, I was given a new task. I was told to prepare for the final phase of my transformation, a ritual that would be performed under the cover of darkness, when the full moon was high in the sky. The moon was important to the cult. Its phases were tied to the progression of the ritual, and on that night, they believed the heavens would align, granting them the power they sought. I was to perform the ritual alone. I would be placed at the center of the altar, and the others would stand in a circle around me, chanting the words of power that would bind me to the cult's will. I had no idea what the full extent of the ritual would entail, but I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. This was it, the moment when everything I had learned, everything I had become, would come to fruition. Father Magnus had warned me that it wouldn't be easy. The transformation requires sacrifice, he had said, his tone serious. You will be tested. Your body, your mind, will be pushed to their limits. But if you endure, you will become one with us. The thought of the ritual terrified me, but it also felt inevitable. I had been shaped, trained, prepared for this moment. The cult had chosen me for a reason, and I had no choice but to play my part. That night, when the moon was full, I was led to the altar. My heart raced, and I could feel the cold sweat running down my back. This was the final test. I had no idea what would happen, but I knew that I couldn't back out now. The cult had already claimed me as their own, and there was no escape. As the chanting began, I felt the power in the room build, a dark energy swirling around me. The symbols on my body began to glow, the same crimson liquid that had burned my skin now pulsing with an otherworldly energy. I closed my eyes and braced myself for what was to come. The chanting grew louder, a low hypnotic rhythm that reverberated through the walls of the cabin. The other members of the cult were standing around me, their faces hidden in shadow, their bodies swaying slightly in time with the ritual. Father Magnus was at the head of the circle, his eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intensity. There was a kind of quiet anticipation in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on everything around us. The altar was cold beneath my body, the stone surface hard against my skin, but I couldn't focus on that. All I could focus on was the growing pressure in the room, the feeling of something immense building around me. The markings on my skin, the symbols that had been etched into me, began to glow with an eerie crimson light. It was like they were alive, pulsing with energy, responding to the chants. I could feel the blood rushing through my veins, my heart pounding in my chest as if it were trying to escape. The pain from the wound on my side flared, and I gasped, clutching at the altar to steady myself. The dagger, the one used in the ritual, had cut deeper than I had realized. It was like the pain was seeping into every part of me, until there was no separation between the wound and my very soul. Focus. Father Magnus's voice echoed in the chamber, his command carrying more weight than ever. This is the moment of transformation. Embrace it. Become one with the new dawn. I could hear the words, but they didn't feel like a command anymore. It felt like a summons, a beckoning to something larger than myself, something ancient. The cult believed in something beyond the physical world, something they called the new dawn, a new age of power, of control, of supremacy over those who were too weak to understand. This ritual was supposed to usher in that dawn, and I was to be the key to its success. I felt a sharp, burning sensation in my chest, like something was tearing through me from the inside out. It was as if my very being was being stretched, pulled apart, only to be reforged into something else, something stronger. The power that had been built up in the room surged, and for a moment, I lost all sense of who I was. I felt weightless, as if I were drifting in some void, untethered, floating in a place between life and death. It was then that I saw it. A vision, like a flash of light, but darker than anything I had ever experienced before. It wasn't a physical place. It was a feeling, a void, a swirling mass of shadows and fire, a realm of infinite darkness. It stretched on endlessly, like the universe itself was collapsing into itself. And within it, there was a presence, an entity, ancient and vast, watching me. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were glowing with an intensity that burned into my soul. The entity spoke, its voice not words, but a feeling, a presence that rippled through my mind. You are the vessel. You are the conduit. You will be the one to bring about the new dawn. I felt it, that terrible weight of the choice it was offering. I could feel the force of the cult behind me, pulling me toward the ritual, urging me to surrender to it, to become one with the entity that sought to rise from the depths of the darkness. They had prepared me for this moment, shaped me into the perfect vessel for whatever they wanted to unleash. But even as the entity's presence suffused my mind, a part of me, something deep inside, fought back. It was a flicker, a small, fragile thing, like a light in the darkest of nights. It wasn't fear, it wasn't panic, it was something else, something that had begun to take root in me ever since that first moment I realized the depth of the cult's plans. It was defiance. I could feel the warmth of the altar beneath me, the solid weight of the stone pressing against my back, and I clung to that sensation, refusing to be swept away entirely into the abyss of the cult's design. There was a choice here, a terrible choice, and for the first time in days, I understood it fully. I could either submit completely, give myself entirely to the cult, let them mold me into the perfect instrument for their godlike power, embrace the entity that loomed in my mind and become a part of this unholy vision. Or I could fight. I could resist. I could try to break free even if I didn't know how. The ritual continued around me, the chanting rising to a fever pitch, but I was no longer listening to it. I could feel the power swirling in the room, trying to envelop me, but I closed my eyes and focused inward. I focused on the small, stubborn ember of resistance that was still alive inside me. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I refused to accept the power they were offering. I refused to become a puppet in their grand design. I would not be the instrument of their darkness. The pain grew sharper. The ritual was nearing its climax, and the energy in the room was building to a terrifying peak. The members of the cult were chanting louder now, their voices a collective force, and I could feel the weight of their will pressing down on me. Father Magnus's voice rang through the chaos, commanding me to submit, to embrace the transformation fully. But I wouldn't. I wouldn't let them win. In that moment of clarity, I made my choice. I broke the connection. With a deep breath, I pushed everything aside. The power, the dark presence, the pull of the ritual, and forced myself to ground myself in the physical world again. I focused on the stone beneath me, the cool air on my skin, the rawness of the wound in my side. I fought to stay in control, to stay conscious. Suddenly, everything stopped. The chanting died down, the pressure in the air lifted, and the room fell into an eerie silence. I opened my eyes to find the cult members staring at me, their faces frozen in shock and disbelief. Father Magnus's expression was one of furious confusion. He didn't understand what had happened, didn't understand why I hadn't succumbed to the power he had so carefully crafted. "You dare?" Father Magnus whispered, his voice trembling with rage. "You dare defy the will of the new dawn?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. I didn't need to. The answer was already clear in my heart. I had made my choice, and whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. But even as I stood there, trembling from the effort of resisting, I knew something important had shifted. I hadn't just fought back against the ritual, I had taken back control of my own fate. And though I was still trapped within the cult's walls, something inside me had been awakened. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence that followed the failed ritual was deafening. Every single person in the room, every cult member, was staring at me as though I were a traitor, a dangerous anomaly that threatened their entire existence. But I could feel it, a flicker of something in the air, something volatile. Their disbelief was quickly turning to anger, and I knew that I was about to face the consequences of my defiance. Father Magnus's gaze was burning into me, his eyes filled with fury and disbelief. He took a slow step forward, his hands trembling ever so slightly. "You think you can defy the new dawn?" he hissed. "You are nothing. You are weak. You are a failure. And now you will pay the price." His words sent a chill down my spine. I'd seen the power of the cult up close, their rituals, their control over the mind and body, and I knew how far they were willing to go to maintain that control. They wouldn't just punish me, they would make an example of me, break me in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. But I wasn't the same person I had been when they first brought me here. Something had changed in me. I could feel the difference in the way I stood, the way I held myself in the face of their cruelty. I wasn't just scared anymore. I was determined to get out. The room was still, the cult members still standing. In their positions, were watching intently. I knew they were waiting for Father Magnus to give the order, to begin the punishment, to force me back into submission. But he hesitated. There was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, as if he couldn't fully comprehend what had just happened. In that moment, I saw my opportunity. I didn't waste a second. My body moved on its own, my heart pounding in my chest as I leaped off the altar, the cold stone beneath me giving way to a surge of adrenaline. I turned and bolted toward the door, ignoring the shouts from behind me. I didn't know how much time I had or how long my lead would last, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get out, and I had to do it now. I slammed into the heavy wooden door, pushing against it with all my strength. To my surprise, it opened with a creak, the hinges groaning under the sudden force. I burst into the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the corridor. The cult members' shouts echoed behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't afford to. Every step I took felt like a race against time, against the cult that would stop at nothing to drag me back into their clutches. The hallways twisted and turned, more labyrinthine than I remembered. I had seen parts of the cabin, but I had never explored it fully. My mind raced, trying to map out the layout in the few seconds I had. There were doors, corridors, windows, but none of them looked familiar. I had no idea where I was going, but the instinct to run was driving me forward. I reached another door, this one larger and heavier than the others. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the knob, my pulse hammering in my ears. I heard footsteps behind me, muffled but growing louder, and I knew that Father Magnus and the others weren't far behind. I couldn't let them catch me. Not now. I threw open the door and rushed inside, finding myself in a small, dimly lit room. It was a storage space of some kind. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old tools, strange objects, and more of the ritualistic items I had seen before. It wasn't much, but it offered the chance to hide, to think, to plan. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I leaned against the cool wall, gasping for breath, trying to steady myself. For a moment, the adrenaline began to wear off, and a wave of dizziness hit me. I had to keep going. I couldn't stop. From outside the room, I could hear the faint sounds of footsteps, the cult members searching for me. I didn't know how long I had before they found me, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to get out of the cabin, out of this nightmare, and somehow find a way to escape their reach. I glanced around the room, searching for something, anything that could help me. And then, on one of the shelves, I saw it. A small, rusted key. It was barely visible among the other objects, but something about it stood out to me. I didn't know why, but I had a feeling that this key was important. Without thinking, I grabbed it, shoving it into my pocket. The sounds of the cult members grew louder now, their voices low but urgent as they searched for me. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave, even if I had no idea where I was going. I pushed open the door and slipped into the hallway, moving as quietly as I could. The footsteps were closer now, and I could hear voices calling my name, their anger and desperation thick in the air. But I kept moving, my mind focused on one thing: escape. I made my way through the winding halls, careful to avoid any creaking floorboards that might give me away. As I moved, I began to feel an unsettling sense of familiarity, as if the cabin itself were guiding me. Every turn I took seemed to lead me in the right direction, and soon I found myself standing in front of a door I had never noticed before. It was smaller than the others, and it didn't have the same heavy, oppressive feel to it. Without thinking, I took the key from my pocket and inserted it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click, and the door creaked open. A rush of cold air hit me as I stepped into the next room. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't a room at all. It was an exit, a hidden passage. It was narrow, winding, and dimly lit, but it stretched out before me like a lifeline. This was my chance, my escape. I didn't hesitate. I ran, faster now, my legs aching, my breath ragged in my chest. The passage seemed to go on forever, but I knew I couldn't stop. The cult was right behind me. I could hear their shouts, their pursuit growing louder. I was so close. I could feel the freedom, the air outside, just beyond reach. And then, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A faint light at the end of the passage. I pushed myself harder, forcing my exhausted body to keep moving, to keep running. The light grew brighter as I got closer, and I could hear the sounds of the cult growing fainter behind me. With one final burst of energy, I reached the end of the passage and found myself outside. I didn't know where I was, but I didn't care. I had escaped. I stumbled out into the cold night air, gasping for breath as my legs threatened to give out beneath me. The sudden shift from the suffocating, dimly lit halls of the cabin to the vast, open wilderness around me was disorienting. My senses were overwhelmed. The sharp scent of pine trees, the crunch of dry leaves beneath my feet, the chilly wind biting at my skin. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to ask myself where I was or where I was going. I just ran. The darkness around me seemed to stretch on endlessly, a blanket that smothered everything in its path. There was no sign of civilization, no lights in the distance, no roads or paths. It was just the wilderness, stretching out in all directions. I didn't even know how far I'd traveled before I stumbled upon the hidden passage. How long had I been in that cabin? Days? Weeks? Time had lost all meaning in that place. I couldn't afford to slow down. I couldn't stop. The fear that had gripped me inside the cabin was still fresh in my mind. The cult would be searching for me, and I knew they wouldn't stop until they found me. Father Magnus would not be content to let me escape. The punishment I had narrowly avoided would be nothing compared to what they would do if they caught me now. I had to get far away. I had to disappear. I ran, ignoring the burn in my legs, the ache in my side where the wound had been reopened in the chaos of the ritual. The adrenaline kept me going, pushing me forward even though I was exhausted, my body screaming in protest. There was no plan, no direction. I was just running. Every step was a chance to distance myself from the nightmare I had left behind. At some point, I could no longer hear the sounds of the cult behind me. Their pursuit had either faltered or was further away than I had feared. But the relief was short-lived. The reality of my situation began to settle in. I was alone. Alone in the wilderness, miles from civilization, with no idea where I was or how to get help. The weight of the past few days, hell, the past few weeks, hit me all at once. I leaned against a tree, gasping for breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. I closed my eyes for a moment just to gather myself. I had to think. I had to survive. But the thought of what I had just escaped was almost too much to process. The cult, their dark rituals, the entity they worshipped, Father Magnus, it all felt like a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream, it was real. And I had no idea how to undo the damage, how to rid myself of the scars they had left on my body and mind. I stood there for a few more moments, gathering my thoughts. But then I heard something. A twig snapped in the distance, a soft rustling. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. The cult had found me. I quickly pressed myself against the tree, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't risk being seen. I had no weapons, no way of defending myself. I had no choice but to hide, to wait for them to pass. I held my breath, trying to steady myself as the sounds drew closer. Footsteps, voices, murmured commands in a language I couldn't understand. They were closing in on me, methodical, as if they already knew where I was. My pulse raced in my ears. I pressed myself closer to the tree, hoping to stay out of sight. I couldn't let them find me. Not yet. Not now. I waited. And waited. The minutes stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. My muscles ached from holding myself in position, but I didn't dare move. If I made even the slightest sound, if I gave away my location, they would catch me. And I knew what would happen if they did. The escape would have been for nothing. Eventually, the sounds grew fainter. The footsteps drifted off, and the voices became distant echoes in the night. I stayed still for a few more moments, just to be sure. When I was certain they were gone, I slowly stood, my legs trembling beneath me. I hadn't been caught. Not yet. But the cult wasn't far behind. I knew I couldn't stay in one place for long. If I didn't keep moving, they would track me down. And as much as I hated to admit it, I had no idea where I was going. I had no survival skills, no knowledge of the terrain, and I didn't have a plan beyond running. I started moving again, picking a direction and hoping it was the right one. My mind was foggy from exhaustion, but I knew I had to focus. I couldn't afford to make mistakes. Every moment spent standing still was another moment the cult could use to close in on me. I had to make it to safety, wherever that might be. Hours passed as I trudged through the wilderness. The cold began to seep into my bones, and my body was starting to give out. My vision blurred with fatigue, and I stumbled, nearly falling face first into the underbrush. The dark trees loomed around me, casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. I had no idea where I was going, but I had to keep moving. I couldn't let myself be found. Eventually, the exhaustion caught up with me. My legs were like lead, my breath ragged and shallow. I collapsed against a tree, too tired to move any farther. I was shaking from both the cold and the fear, but there was no time to rest. I had to keep going. I had to. Just as I was about to push myself back to my feet, I heard something again, a soft crackle of branches. Footsteps, coming closer. I knew it wasn't my imagination this time. They had found me. Again. I looked around in panic, my heart racing as I frantically searched for a way to escape. The landscape around me was unforgiving. The trees too dense to hide in, the ground too uneven to run without making noise. But just as I thought I was cornered, I saw something. A faint light in the distance. It wasn't much, just a flicker, but it was enough. It wasn't the cult. It was something else. It was my only chance. The faint light in the distance was my last hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. I took one last look over my shoulder. Nothing, no sign of the cult members yet. But I knew they were close. I couldn't afford to waste any more time. With what little strength I had left, I pushed myself off the tree and stumbled toward the light. Each step felt like I was dragging myself through mud, my legs heavy, my body nearly spent. But the light grew stronger as I moved, and soon I could make out the outline of a small cabin in the distance. It wasn't much, rustic, with a weathered roof and a dim light glowing through the windows, but it was a sign of life, of safety, or at least a place to hide. I stumbled toward the door, my vision blurred from exhaustion, my heart racing. I reached for the knob, my fingers trembling, and I pushed the door open. Inside, the warmth of a fire greeted me, along with the soft, reassuring presence of someone who wasn't part of the cult. A man, middle-aged with a grizzled beard and an unassuming presence, sat by the fire, a book in his hands. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "You look like you've been running for a long time," he said, his voice calm but laced with concern. I didn't know who he was, but in that moment, he was my lifeline. I collapsed into a chair by the fire, gasping for breath, my body racked with exhaustion. "Please, help me," I managed to whisper. They're after me, the cult. They won't stop." The man didn't ask questions. He stood up immediately, his face hardening with determination. "You're safe here for now, but you'll need to move quickly. It's not safe to stay in one place too long." I didn't have the strength to question him. I nodded weakly, my mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts and fears. The cult was still out there, hunting me. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't alone. The man packed quickly, gathering what little supplies he had. He handed me a coat, rough and worn but warm, and motioned for me to follow. As we stepped out into the cold night again, I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't care. I just needed to keep moving. We walked for hours, through dense trees and winding paths, until I was no longer sure of the direction. The man knew these woods, though, and kept a steady pace, never stopping to rest. I was too tired to speak, too tired to even think. I simply followed him, my mind focused only on putting distance between me and the cult. By the time we reached the outskirts of a small town, dawn was beginning to break, the first light of day creeping over the horizon. The man led me into a small, run-down motel, its neon sign flickering weakly in the early morning light. He didn't speak much, just paid for a room and handed me the key. "Rest," he said. "You're safe for now, but you'll need to stay low for a while. They'll be looking for you." I nodded, too exhausted to thank him, too weary to do anything other than follow his instructions. He left quickly, disappearing into the early morning fog, and I shut the door behind me, collapsing onto the bed. I had escaped, but the nightmare wasn't over. I couldn't let my guard down, not yet. The cult would come for me again. I knew that. But for now, I was free. I had a moment of peace, a moment to breathe. The next few days were a blur. I stayed in that motel, hiding out, trying to gather my strength and figure out what to do next. The man had given me enough to survive, and for that, I would be forever grateful. But I couldn't stay there forever. The cult would find me eventually. I had to keep moving, keep running. But there was one thing I knew for certain. I couldn't let them control me anymore. I couldn't let them dictate my life. I would fight, I would resist, and I would do whatever it took to stay free. The cult had taken so much from me, my childhood, my innocence, my peace of mind. But they would not take my future. I would survive. I would find a way to stop them. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. It was small, fragile, but it was enough. I wasn't going to let them win.